Japanese pilots resorted to kamikaze missions. These desperate onslaughts caused substantial damage to the American ships.
Following the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the American conquest of the Marianas became a hard-fought and bloody land action. The Japanese defenders resisted stoutly, but the islands were taken. Saipan and Tinian were followed by Guam, with the intricate network of cave defenses there being cleared by August the 12th. The fall of the islands and the naval defeat underlined the weakening of Japan's position, though there was no official acknowledgement of the gravity of the situation. Significantly, however, the dramatic events in the Marianas were followed by the resignation of General Tojo's government. Attention now turned toward the Philippines, with the Japanese dedicating priority to their defense, while the Americans prepared to invade. Preliminaries to the main offensive came with the American attacks and occupations of Morotai and the Palau Islands. The invasions were very well-practiced affairs, America's domination of the air providing a fairly firm guarantee of success. On the other hand, the tenacity of the Japanese defenders guaranteed that there was a high price to be paid for victory. The occupation of the Palaus gave America new air bases within 500 miles of the Philippines, and the stage was set for the next big move. Where the Americans were going from strength to strength, the losses in the Marianas had left the Japanese fleet carriers almost without planes and fatally stricken by the loss of irreplaceable air crew. The Japanese situation was also being handicapped by fuel shortages, as the flow of oil from Indonesia had slowed to a trickle. The loss of the Philippines would cut off even this and render the fleet immobile. The Imperial High Command was left with no option but to fight in the Philippines, with whatever resources it had left. Again, the chiefs in Tokyo prepared an elaborate battle plan. If the carriers were without teeth to fight on, then perhaps they could be the bait to lure an American fleet into range of the battleships. When the American invasion of the island of Leyte sent the Philippines campaign off in earnest, the Tokyo admirals set their plan in motion. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle of all time, was made up of 4 distinct actions. A total of 282 ships were engaged, as well as hundreds of aircraft. It began with Admiral Halsey's flat tops attacking the Japanese battleships, the reverse of what the Japanese had planned. Halsey then took his task groups to wipe out the almost planeless Japanese carriers. When the surviving Japanese battleships turned back in 2 groups to attack, one arm was rebuffed, but the main thrust burst through and bore down on the beachhead.
They looked like pagodas, walking on the water. Here they were, coming over the horizon, right straight for us. Well, there wasn't anything to do but to turn around and start running. While this was going on, of course, we were arming the rest of our planes, but in order to launch, we had to turn right back into the Japanese fleet again, because that's where the wind was from. Of course, all this time we were under fire, you understand.
Confronting the Japanese giants were 6 puny escort carriers and a handful of destroyers. They had no chance of holding back the Japanese ships, but put up a spirited defense as they retired. The Japanese Admiral, Kurita, was worried that Halsey would cut off his retreat, unsure of what strength remained in the confusion of ships in the crowded Gulf.
In the late morning, after we'd been under fire for over 2 hours, the Japanese admiral turned around and headed back. I read somewhere that he thought that he was running into the heavy carrier groups.
Even while Kurita was turning away, the first kamikaze attack took place. Admiral Onishi, commanding the air forces in the Philippines, had approached a startled Admiral Toyota with his revolutionary new measure and had been given approval. His request had followed the lone action of Rear Admiral Orima, who had flown a dive bomber into the flight deck of the USS Franklin. His example had spurred so many volunteers that Onishi then sought to formalize the activity and secure official sanction for such desperate action. The kamikaze's introduction coincided with the demise of the remaining Japanese carriers. Admiral Halsey may have been in error on leading the invasion unprotected, but he managed to get his attacks on the Japanese carriers in, and 4 of the ships went down. By the time the American air attacks came, the Japanese fleet had only 19 Zeros left to defend it. In the aftermath of the battle, the Japanese Navy could no longer be seen as a significant threat. The American losses had once again been relatively small, and the Philippines invasion had been uninterrupted throughout the naval action. The significant and terrifying arrival of the kamikazes on the scene was the only gloomy aspect to a campaign that was proceeding smoothly. Kamikaze attacks increased. 23 carriers were hit in 3 months, 2 escort carriers sinking. 7 fleet carriers had been hit. The damage caused by these strikes ranged from minor to catastrophic. In that time, Admirals Nimitz and Halsey kept the carrier groups hovering around the Philippines, where they were the deciding factor once again. The kamikazes would have wiped out the invasion fleets, but for the protection of the carrier planes. Troop ships, supply ships, battleships, assault craft, all were just so many targets without command of the air. The carriers patrolled and attacked. The task groups had swung out in January to punish targets in China and Formosa. The kamikaze attacks pursued the carriers. Ticonderoga was badly damaged off Formosa on the 21st of January, as the fighting around the Philippines finally died down. 4 days later, the last kamikaze mission from the Philippines was flown. There had been 421 kamikaze sorties from the islands, with 16 ships sunk and another 87 damaged. These results are unambiguous. The measure was effective. The attacks would keep coming to the end of the war. The kamikaze attacks were measured by the West as the height of insanity, and the expression suicide attacks was used to describe them. Suicide is, however, the wrong word entirely. There was no connotation of hopelessness or despair about the actions of a kamikaze pilot. He had faith that his actions retained worth and contributed to his country. The kamikaze's death did not give up life or devalue it. The life was passed on to those who remained. In theory, the kamikazes ushered in the age of the guided missile. Sweeping down into the anti-aircraft fire, the plane was steered not simply to hit a ship, but to hit the most vulnerable or critical part of a ship. The punch was heavier and more accurate than any bomb. After the Philippines campaign, Admiral Halsey had handed the fleet back to Admiral Spruance and had gone off to prepare the invasion of Japan. Spruance had been preparing the invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa as the next steps to be taken. The island of Iwo Jima was invaded on the 19th of February, and fighting continued until the end of March. There was only one sizable kamikaze attack on the 21st of February. The escort carrier Bismarck C was sunk, and Saratoga and 4 other ships were badly damaged. Even when the ships retired to their base at Ulithi to prepare for the move on Okinawa, the kamikazes pursued. Randolph was hit at the anchorage in an attack on the 11th of March and suffered considerable damage. She was rammed by a twin-engine bomber carrying a 2,000-pound bomb. The fires were contained and casualties were light. When Admiral Spruance inspected the damage on the Randolph, he would not have been aware of quite what was going to happen at Okinawa. There was no doubt that further kamikaze attacks would come, but the ferocity and volume of the attacks would be another shocking reminder of the Japanese commitment and self-denying faith. Spruance had shown himself at Midway and the Marianas to be a capable, thoughtful leader. But leadership was a limited asset against the onslaught of kamikaze attacks that was to come. The American fleet's pre-invasion strikes began with attacks on the airfields of Kyushu, the close-range bombardment of the Japanese home islands underlining the increasing helplessness of the defenders. The carrier planes swept the Japanese coast of shipping, large and small, and brushed aside most of the weight of the attacks from Japanese planes. The Japanese achieved some revenge on March 19th, when several planes managed to barge through defenses and score hits on Enterprise, Yorktown, Wasp, and Franklin. Franklin was terribly damaged. Bombs exploded in the hangar where planes had just been fueled and armed, ready for a raid, and the resulting fires set off a series of explosions that rocked her for 5 hours. Heroic firefighting efforts were to see the ship saved, but Franklin suffered 832 men killed and a further 270 injured. Franklin, with some of her crew evacuated, lay stopped and burning in the water, rocked by explosions. Her ordeal was to go on for 2 days, with fires still breaking out a day later when she had finally been taken in tow. As the Americans moved closer to the Japanese homeland, the ferocity of the defense intensified. With the stiffer resistance came a mounting tide of kamikaze attacks. This would reach its peak during the campaign around Okinawa. The Japanese had hoarded a supply of aircraft for a frightening new campaign. This called for massed kamikaze flights to progressively wipe out the American radar picket line of destroyers and then swamp the fleet proper with sheer numbers. They had available over 2,100 planes for this operation, and they were to lose 1,400 of them. The fight to save the Franklin succeeded, and she eventually limped back to the anchorage at Ulithi under her own steam. That she survived the attack and the following explosions and fires is, in view of the damage she suffered, astonishing. Certainly it serves as a testament to the hardiness of the Essex-class carriers and to the care taken in both their design and construction. But she was so badly damaged that she would never be repaired. She set off for her home port, New York, on a long and lonely voyage that would be, effectively, her last. The kamikaze attacks reached such an intensity that Admiral Spruance was forced to reorganize his ships as 3 task groups instead of 4, because there was a constant rotation of carriers back to base for repairs. The mast raids, called Kikusui, started on the 6th of April with an attack by 355 kamikazes and continued to the 12th of May. Over 1,800 kamikaze sorties were flown over this period, and 930 were shot down. 17 ships were sunk and 198 damaged, including 12 carriers and 10 battleships. The conquest of Okinawa proved to be an agonizingly slow and bloody process. With the Japanese defenders holding out more strongly than ever, there was no way to build up land-based air strength, and the carriers were held on station, exposed but essential. Air cover had to be provided. Even with the presence of the carriers, the damage being done was severe. The kamikaze tactic had been born in part because of the shortage of skilled pilots. It was to be the same factor that limited the tactic's effectiveness. The poorly trained reserve pilots not only lacked the skill to survive in aerial combat, they lacked the skill to intercept and ram a ship in the most effective way. They were barely in command of their planes, and the job asked of them required considerable ability, even if their craft wasn't damaged in approach. During the Kikusui attacks at Okinawa, losses were between 60 and 90% each mission, and wastage at this rate could of course not be sustained for long, in pilots or planes. The fury of kamikaze activity had to weaken. Attacks continued to the end of the war, but they became more infrequent and were flown as smaller affairs. Sometimes individual planes would appear, darting to attack. The Japanese war effort was exhausted. Planes and ships sat idle for lack of fuel. The mighty Yamamoto left port with enough oil for a one-way trip to Okinawa, but didn't even get that far. The task force off Japan's shore deployed 14 fleet carriers, 4 of them British, and 6 light carriers. They could put up a combined strength of 1,450 aircraft. With this power and the long-range Air Force operations, all Japanese movement ground to a halt. The sky over Japan was dominated by American aircraft, which left the islands isolated. Both sides braced for the resolution. Over 400 ships were sunk or damaged by kamikaze attack in the last 11 months of the war. Though they did not alter the outcome of the conflict, they certainly made their impression. Like the Germans, the Japanese experimented with remote-controlled missiles. But there were so many problems and so little time that these plans were amended to include pilots, to further institutionalize the acceptance of the kamikaze pilot as a disposable component. The Japanese agreed to surrender on the 15th of August, the documents being signed on the 2nd of September. The arrival of Americans in Tokyo had not been fought out in landings. The Japanese had been remorselessly pounded from the air. the constant hammering of the long-range B-29s being punctuated by the concentrated fury of the unpredictable carrier-based swarms. Most Japanese were unaware of the atomic blasts until after the war, but they were all aware of the terror of the constant bombing. The Emperor spoke on the 14th, and the nation accepted. Negotiations were brief. There was no bargaining position left. The only concession made to the Japanese was that the Emperor's sovereignty would be recognized. The formal signing of the Instrument of Surrender was ceremonially enacted on the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Harbor. Admiral Nimitz had ordered that full vigilance against kamikaze attacks be maintained to the end, even after Japan's capitulation. Franklin's dreadful ordeal would not be repeated. The last attacks came on the 15th of August, but had no effect. The fighter cover was impenetrable. The battering was over. Peace had been a long time coming, and the price had been massive. The Franklin, back home in New York.
They rely on the element of surprise and incredible speed to strike out at the enemy. Fly the latest jet attack aircraft. Next on Firepower. Then at 10 Eastern, G-Men versus the Mob, as Crime Inc. continues.